What a moment that was, Nick. Listening back to that now, it almost feels like something from another age of politics, doesn't it? I mean, you forget just how contentious it was at the time. It feels like we've moved a long way since then.
It does. I mean, it is extraordinary how something over the course of 10 years that was contentious for some at the time is really essentially non-contentious now. I mean, we've seen public support for same-sex marriage just increase year on year. And that's true not just in this country, but in many others as well. I think the latest poll showed it was supported sort of 80% of the population here in the UK, and not many polls show support for something at that sort of level. And there are now 33 countries around the world. So it's covering about a sixth of the world's population, 1.35 billion people that have passed some form of same-sex marriage, and others that many more actually that are looking at civil unions. So I do think that this is something of a global tide, and I'm very proud, having led the Freedom to Marry campaign at the time, of having played a small part in it.
Taking us back to the politics of the time, you were obviously an MP, a Conservative MP on David Cameron's benches. You'd served in his government. I mean, a lot of that opposition to this was actually within your own party, wasn't it, as far as Westminster was concerned? That must have made it very hard for yourself and for David Cameron.
Yeah, that's true. There was some opposition in the other parties, but it's interesting to reflect that some of that opposition, we had just about half of Conservative MPs voting against the legislation, and an enormous number of them have now said that they regret that, and some have made formal apologies in the Commons, others say it publicly or privately, and that actually is something that many of us predicted, because the same thing had happened over civil partnerships, and I think that many members of Parliament found themselves on the wrong side of the argument. I think they were affected by the views that were coming particularly from within the Church of England, that somehow thought that heterosexual marriage, the institution of marriage, was going to be affected by this. But of course, no church would ever have been compelled to allow same-sex marriage. And in fact, the Church of England was specifically prohibited from it by the legislation in what was called a religious lock. And it's not often that we, as members of Parliament, pass legislation that had the sole effect of making people happy. There was no detrimental effect as a consequence of what we did. All that happened is that around 7,000 people a year now, which is about 3% of marriages in this country, are same-sex marriages, and people are able to enter into a commitment. That's a good thing for the institution, for them, for society, and it makes them happy. And really, in all the votes that I took part in as a member of Parliament over the 14 years or so that I was an MP, I can't think of many that actually made my constituents happy. Well, this is one that did.
You're a sort of grandee now, hopefully floating a bit above party politics. How much credit should we be giving to the Lib Dems as part of this recollection? Was this really just David Cameron driving this through on his own, or was this something that was really only going to happen because of the particular nature of that coalition, do you think?
I just want to pause just for a second on being called a grandee, which I never thought would happen. Look, one or two of the Liberals have sort of claimed almost sole credit for the fact that this happened, which I think is over-egging it somewhat. We were in a coalition government, so the Lib Dem support was important, and there were definitely big champions like Lynn Featherstone, and Nick Clegg was strongly in support. But in the end, it was David Cameron who took what I think was, at the time, a pretty courageous decision, actually, in the true sense of the word, to do this. And he spoke about it at the Conservative Party conference, and if you remember, got applause from the grassroots when he did. And he located the argument in a Conservative argument. He said that he believed in equal marriage, not in spite of being a Conservative, but because he was a Conservative, because he believed in the institution of marriage and the freedom of people to enter that. And he has said subsequently that he thinks it's one of his sort of proudest and most important political decisions when in office. But I also think he took a hit from it. And there was some opposition at the time, and there was some loss of members from Conservative associations, and they may have gone to to UKIP. So it was important that a Conservative Prime Minister stood up and did this, but it was also important that there was a big cross-party majority in both houses of Parliament for it. And really, once it had that huge majority in the Commons, the bill was set fair. What was interesting, it then had a very big majority in the Lords as well. And I think that caused quite a lot of the opponents of it to stop and think, were they really on the right side of this argument?
I think I'm right in saying that you said at the time that you would like to have seen same-sex marriage go even further, all the way to the church, and said it was a regret for you that you couldn't be married in a church. Can you just reflect on that for us? And is that something where you'd still like to see maybe further legislation or further action?
I certainly wouldn't support legislation to impinge upon religious freedom. I thought it was a fundamental aspect of the legislation that churches are allowed to take that decision, by which I mean faith organisations. I think it would be appalling if the state dictated to churches that they had to do something that contravened their beliefs. And in fact, we amended the Equality Act to make it clear that nobody could be compelled to conduct a same-sex marriage against their will. But it's worth noting that the major faith organisations now do say they will conduct same-sex marriages, including Anglican ones. So the Scottish Episcopal Church, the Church of Scotland, as well as the United Reformed Church, the Methodists. And so I think there is this steadily moving tide, and the Church of England is lagging behind that. I hope that one day the Church of England will decide to do it. It decided recently at its synod that it would allow blessing same-sex couples, which seemed to me to be a step forward, but clearly isn't enough for many. But in the end, I think that's a decision that the church itself has to take. I don't think that can be a decision that's dictated by members of Parliament. I mean, that is surely the essence of religious freedom, because you can still enter a civil marriage. So the churches haven't been able to prevent that. The question is what form of marriage is allowed within their own institution.